We may well get some more join as we go. So I think we had quite a lot of registrations. I think most people are in, but if more appear, I'm sure you'll let them in, Tracey.
It's out of my control, Alistair.
It's out of yours.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Well, the team will let them in anyway.
Welcome
everybody. Just by way of introduction, we don't really have any kind of housekeeping as we normally would in terms of lose and fire exits, obviously. We've got obviously a conversation here and a presentation by Albert Goodman around the implications from an accounting and taxation point of view on the job retention scheme. Obviously, it's new to a lot of businesses, and it's new to all of us, in fact. If you do have questions as we're running through this, feel free to use the group chat. I'll try and keep an eye on that. What we found works quite well is if you have specific questions, feel free to post them in there, and then at the end or towards the end of the webinar, I'll pick out some questions that I think are going to be relevant to people, and we can see if Tracey can support on those questions. So without further ado, I will pass over to Tracey from Albert Goodman.
Thanks, Alistair. Welcome to this morning's webinar, and thank you to the Chamber for inviting us to present to you this morning. Now, we've been doing a lot of webinars over the last week or so, giving businesses advice on COVID-19 and all the government support that's being given. Richard Bugler, our managing partner, has been doing regular updates. He's doing those on a Monday, and he repeats them on Tuesday afternoons. So please do register for those because businesses are finding those really helpful. If you just go to our website, you'll find all the various links. There's also information on our website to various links on the government website where all the information is being posted. Now, the job retention scheme is the area that we probably have had the most questions on as we've been going through the webinars about. That's where all the chat has been coming from. So the Chamber thought it was a really good idea to do this as a standalone presentation. Now, it is a significant package of help to businesses, but we're still waiting some of the finer detail, although we're better placed now than we were when it was first announced. Right. So this morning, we're going to go through a short intro and welcome, and then we'll look at the scheme itself, what it is, who can claim, and what the furlough process might entail, and then what pay you're looking at when you're calculating the claim to make. And then we'll run through a couple of examples. Employees will be accruing certain rights whilst off on furlough, and there will be an impact on the business going forwards. There are pros and cons with the scheme, so we'll take a quick look at those and then look at the particular aspects that might affect personal service companies, and this is another area where we're seeing a lot of questions. A couple of other aspects of generally dealing with employees when people are working from home, and then Alistair will be looking at some of the questions and answers given through this morning. I'm being supported this morning by Michael Evans, who heads up our payroll team in Yeovil. And as I understand from Michael, the queries on this are absolutely flooding through the payroll at the moment, and he's already had more than 40 just this morning. So I'm Tracey Watts, and I head up our fantastic tax team at Albert Goodman. That includes all of the business tax advisors and the personal tax advisors, but my particular area of specialism tends to be looking after our businesses. And that can include looking at things like research and development relief claims, capital allowances, business restructuring, which I'm sure will be a key area going forwards, as well as buying and selling businesses. And I also deal with more of the complex inquiries from HMRC. So I do tend to spend a lot of my time looking at how payroll works, and looking at all of the due diligence area, and then defending clients when they come under attack from the revenue. As I said, Michael heads up our payroll team and attends a lot of roundtabling with payroll discussion. So he's going to be really well placed to answer your questions this morning. I must just point out that we are not HR advisors, so a lot of this with furloughing of employees will need legal input, and we'll be doing another presentation later this week with an employment lawyer, but I would urge you to seek specialist advice where needed. Now, our audience this morning is a diverse mix of businesses and sizes. Some of you will do your own payroll, some of you will have outsourced it, but are looking for guidance on how to go through the furlough process. And we're all going to be impacted by this to varying degrees. Those with more employees are obviously going to be more affected by the measures from forcing businesses to close than those that may be driven by machinery-backed trades. So what is the job retention scheme? Well, it was first announced on the 20th of March. Very little detail was given at that point, but I think there was a collective sigh of relief across the country that the government were going to be giving some help to employers, and also to give money to employees who had possibly been laid off or were likely to be laid off. Now, the retention scheme gives a taxable grant back to the employee, which is then used to cover wages that they might not necessarily otherwise have been able to pay. So the two will net each other out, so there should be no tax to pay as a result on this. But the grant income that is then used to pay the wages, so that actual physical wage payment, is still a normal wage cost. So it still goes through your RTI system, and it will attract employers' NIC and pension entitlement. Now, one of the very welcome announcements on the 26th of March, when the Chancellor gave more details on this, was that not only were the government going to support 80% of the wage costs, capped at 2,500, but they were also going to pay the employer's NIC and the basic pension costs back to the employer. Now, these measures are in place for 3 months only, and they're backdated to the 1st of March. So the scheme at the moment is set to end on the 31st of March, but the Chancellor did say at the time that it would be extended if necessary. So who can apply? Now, unlike some of the grant income that's available, this is open to all businesses within the UK, regardless of their size and regardless of their sector. The only conditions that you have to meet are that the business had a UK payroll up and running on the 28th of February 2020. It has to have a UK bank account to receive the grant income into, and it only applies to employees in the business at 28th of February. So if you had any new starters since that date, they won't be covered under the furlough scheme. And then the overriding requirement is that it's in respect of furloughed employees only. So furlough was a bit of a new term when it was first referred to on the 20th of March. It is more commonly used in the US, and they use it when they lay off employees. Now, furloughing for our purposes will mean where you no longer have the immediate use of those employees, but you intend to bring them back into the business when this is all over. And during their furlough period, they're not allowed to undertake any work for you. So who is covered? It's your employees who are on your payroll at 28th of February. It covers all full or part-time workers, anybody under zero contracts, 0-hour contracts, and also agency workers that you put through your payroll. It's not clear whether or not it includes apprentices yet, but we're working on the assumption that it does. So when you're looking at your furloughed workers, they can't provide you with any services and they can't generate any income for you. So it does have to be a genuine layoff, and we're also recommending that workers shouldn't be accessing their work emails. It unfortunately doesn't apply where you've reduced hours for your workers. So if you've gone from 5 down to 3 days a week, for example, because there's just not enough work to keep them busy, you won't be able to claim for the additional 2 days under the furlough scheme. And that's where the decisions can become quite difficult, because when you reduce hours down to, say, 3 days, if you're reducing pay by the equivalent prorated amount, then the worker might actually prefer to be furloughed instead, rather than possibly picking up extra work but doing it in fewer hours. So there is an employee and employer relationship aspect to consider there. When you put workers on furlough, they have to go off for a minimum of 3 weeks at a time. You can dip in and dip out of it. So at the end of the 3-week period, for example, there might be work for that particular employee to come back to and carry on in the short term. But then if the whole COVID continues and all the restrictive measures that we've got in place continues, then you might put them back out on furlough again, but only if the scheme is still continuing at that point. So it does give some flexibility for you. Now, if somebody's already on SSP at the moment, you can't furlough that employee. So you'll have to wait until the SSP period is ended before then considering whether they need to go on furlough. If you've got any employees who are already on unpaid leave before February 28th, then you'll have to wait for them to return to the workplace before then considering whether that's somebody you would like to furlough. So how do you claim? Well, the Revenue are busy building a new portal at the moment. They do think it will be up and running by the end of April and making the first payments by then. I have to say I'm slightly sceptical on this, given the speed that they've delivered other digital platforms, but maybe they will be using an existing one and just making changes to that. Because you will already be paying some employees under the furlough scheme, there is a funding gap on all of this, and the revenue site does encourage you to look at alternative funding sources so that you can continue to pay wages before then claiming the grant in April. Don't forget, any payments of VAT are temporarily on hold. That's automatic. If you do have a direct debit set up, then please do cancel those at least 5 days before the collection point. You can also enter into time to pay agreements with the revenue to defer payment of any PAYE liabilities. And also for self-employed people who do have a payroll below them, there's also the deferral of the July payment on account. So again, more measures looking to support business owners. When the portal is up and running, the details that you have to enter will be your EPAYE reference number. You'll have to provide the bank details for the business and then specify the period that you're actually making the claim for. So typically for most of us, the first claim period will include that longer period going back to 1st of March if relevant. You'll have to enter all of your employee details where they've been furloughed, and then you have to calculate the claim amount that you're claiming the grant for. and then you'll have to provide your name and contact details. All of these claims will be subject to HMRC audit at a later date, so please make sure that you're keeping full records in the event of a check. Those that work with accountants that offer fee protection, I would strongly encourage them to take out cover so that they can cover the costs of any professional fees in helping you through your audit process. So to actually identify all your employees that this is going to apply for, you have to look carefully at your selection process, and this is where it becomes quite an HR type of activity. So if you are selecting your employees for redundancy, it's very similar to that process. You have to look at the discrimination rules and the equality rules. Make sure that you're selecting the people that you're putting on furlough in a fair way. Do document that furlough process in the event of an employee claim at a later date. For many employees, this is going to constitute a change of their contractual agreement with their employer. So unless the contract already provides for the employer to reduce hours when there's an economic downturn, then you're going to have to agree those changes mutually, and I would strongly recommend that that is put in writing between the parties. Now, in reality, this might actually be a stark choice between being made redundant and accepting those changes, but you still do need to go through that process. So do take legal advice, please. Once you've selected all of your furloughed employees, they can't work for the business anymore. So it's the period that they stop working for you that you're actually calculating this pay for. Now you have to calculate the reduced pay, and we'll look at an example of that shortly. Now, because the government are only paying the 80% capped at 2,500, that will leave it a shortfall for many employees, and you've got the right to top that up if you want to, although I would say that typically we're seeing employers not making that top up. Now you run the payroll in the usual way, but using the reduced figures, and then you do the claim back of the grant through the portal, and you're allowed to submit one claim every 3 weeks. Now, what do you actually pay? Now, it depends whether your employees are full or part-time workers, or whether they're on a variable hour contract. So if they're full or part-time, you have to look at the salary that they were paid on 28th of February 2020. If they're on a variable hour contract, then you've got a choice, and you can choose the higher of either the wages that were paid for the same period in 2019, or you look at the average of what was paid to them over the last 12 months. And you will have to look at that calculation because, believe me, employees will be looking at this themselves, and if they believe that you've chosen the lower amount to claim on, then they could make a claim against you. Now, we know that this specifically excludes any payments of bonuses or commissions or other fees, but the guidance that came out on the 26th of March was silent on what to do about overtime. Now, this does pose a problem for businesses because if you pay that overtime now, so you look at what the wages were over the last 12 months, including overtime, you could run the risk of not having that covered within the grant claim when more detail is released. The other problem you could face is that if you don't pay the overtime now, and so you roll that over to